My guest today is Ralph Schoellhammer.
I'm an assistant professor for political science at Webster University in Vienna. It's a small American university that's a kind of an overseas campus of Webster University in St. Louis. My main field of research is actually political theory and political culture. So in case any critic immediately will say that I'm not a climate expert or something like that, then that's absolutely true. But in my defense, neither is Greta Thunberg. So I feel if she has the right to voice up on these issues, I think I have so too. I have been publishing quite a lot recently, both academically, but also in newspapers, in journals, and on all kinds of issues from the war in Ukraine to energy policies to climate. So I'm a little bit of there's the famous example that of the foxes and the hedgehog, like one knows a lot about one thing and others know a little bit about a lot of things. So I would probably fall more into the latter category. I think that for whatever reason, many of the issues that I've been touching on for years, they kind of have grown in the audience that they gather. The interest has significantly grown over the last years.
Well, let's talk about where your work has been. I just have a list here. It seems like you've been everywhere. That in print, you're in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Spiked, the American Spectator. And then I saw you had a video that has 3.7 million views on Sky News Australia. You did a Jordan Peterson podcast with Bjorn Lomborg. You interviewed the Green Chicken Doomberg. You interviewed You interviewed Victor Davis Hanson. And you are going to be a co-host with Tracy Schuchart, right? Shy Girl on another podcast. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So you've been everywhere. Is it just the last year or two that you've suddenly been everywhere, or have you been involved in the media for a long time?
It really happened over the last year, over the last 18 months. To be honest, as you just mentioned, right, it was one article in Newsweek about the kind of the revolt from above, the issue with elite proposals and how it affects the working class. And then it's just mentioned the Sky News interview. I still not entirely sure why so many people watched it, but that kind of was really the liftoff. And since then it has been, I'm very grateful and very humbled by it, because I don't think that any of the things I'm saying are particularly controversial. I think I'm just, at least that's my impression, I give voice to things that most people intuitively feel. Maybe I'm just a little bit luckier in formulating them, but I'm really humbled and intimidated in many ways, I have to say, from the feedback that I've received so far.
I've watched a lot of your podcasts and I've read your stuff, and it's so deeply sane that I'm wondering, why have you not been canceled? You're an academic in Europe and you have not been canceled for saying the stuff you're saying? What's going on there?
So far, I've been lucky. I try to stay, I have to admit, this is an advice I can give to everyone. I try to stay clear of controversy. Like I can be a little facetious on Twitter. We all do it, a little trolling on the internet, a little trolling on Twitter. Everybody does it. But I try never to attack somebody personally. I'm a huge fan of the mute button. So, in the comments, I don't get in fights. If there is a serious question or a comment, I'm more than happy to interact. But if it's just some kind of trolling or personal insult, there was a time when this really bothered me. And I think this is true for all of us at some point, right? It's somebody who writes something and then they move on and do the same to somebody else. And then you and I probably sit at home and have our face in our hands and say, oh my God, why is this person not liking me? And how can I convince this person that no, I no longer do this? And so far, I have to admit, the least confrontational I've been, so has been the feedback. So I was very lucky so far. I'm happy to talk with everyone. I'm open to every conversation. I'm very, very lucky about my university. They so far have been very supportive. Like there have been no actions or no complaints or no advice in the sense of you might want to look out what you're doing. So far I have been very, very lucky, and I hope that it stays that way.
But it's not like everybody at your university agrees with you, right? I look through their Twitter feed and it looks like they are, some may at least believe in the climate crisis. But even it sounds like they're open to having people on both sides of some issues and allowing them to talk. I'm loving it.
Yeah, exactly. That's very true. And I'm not the same. Like, I'm open to my colleagues, I'm open to my students. Everybody knows where I'm coming from. I'm not hiding the ball. I'm also not trying to indoctrinate anybody. I mean, everybody can come to their own conclusions. And I think that's, at least for me so far, this has been a successful strategy. Now, there are some areas I do stay clear of, right? I don't kind of, march head on in every culture war or in every aspect of what's contemporarily counting as a controversy. But I have my fields, I have my issues, and I hope I can continue to comment on it the way I have been doing. Fingers crossed. I'm sure that as the audience grows, for example, with having the great chance and opportunity to appear in your podcast, probably at some point there will be some backlash, but what can you do? I'm still a very small voice in this whole debate. And I have a couple of online events. I've been at the summer school of the Academy of Ideas in London, right, where we interacted a lot with students and young people, which was fantastic. They seem to be much more open-minded, I think, than we often think. But again, I'm not, planning a speaking tour or anything. Like, this is going to happen if next year my first book comes out. I think then a speaking tour will be in order.
Are you working at all with climate skeptics like Net Zero Watch or Car 26? Any folks like that over in Europe, or?
We are in touch. Yeah, a particular Net Zero Watch, right? We're in touch. We exchange emails. We kind of keep ourselves up to date. So it's clearly like, once you have kind of planted your flag on one side of the debate, let's put it this way, I think these connections kind of happen almost naturally. But again, so far, this is one of the other things. One should never be, kind of afraid then to march together or to cooperate with those who have a similar outlook, right? We probably don't agree on everything, right? It's not a 100% overlap on ideas and opinions, but it's good to get the voices out there. I mean, there is a lack of alternative voices, if you want to call it, in this debate in general. And this is, I think, the big blessing of the internet in many ways, because without it, I'm pretty sure that we really would only have one opinion. And there wouldn't even be any kind of debate whether there should be another side to listen to, because there simply would no possibility for us to say anything. But I'm very, very happy that this is possible.
Have you had any trouble getting your stuff published in places like Newsweek? I'm impressed that they're publishing your stuff. You're saying stuff about the uprising against the elites. Is there resistance to that?
No, they have. For those of you who don't know it, her name is Batya Ungar-Sargon. She's the opinion editor at Newsweek. She's, first of all, a fantastic human being. She has written a great book on the problem of wokeness in the media, even though she comes more at it from an economic viewpoint than a cultural viewpoint. And they really try there to allow all sides of the debate. So there are legacy media out there who really made the shift to also allow for, let's say, controversial opinions or opposing opinions. So I never had any problem there. On the contrary, so I can really only speak in the highest terms of the editorial team, and particularly of Batya over at Newsweek.
Okay, that's a revelation to me, because I had highlighted a couple different stories of yours, and I just realized that they're both in Newsweek. One of them is about maybe from a year ago. A popular uprising against the elites has gone global. Fantastic stuff there. Do you have any update on that? How do you think the uprising is going right now against the elites?
Well, I think it's in some areas it's still happening. You see it particularly in Europe, right? I mean, there are significant political shifts in Europe. In most countries, with a few exceptions, it's mostly from the right. But very often this is not because these right-wing parties have necessarily particularly compelling programs, right? One of the main reasons is they are protest voices. Some of them, however, I think this should also be mentioned, some of them do have programs, and I think some of them actually have, in my view at least, have programs that are worth a second look. Like the Sweden Democrats, for example, are not just a right-wing party. They, I would argue, are very, very open, for example, to nuclear energy. They're very open to ideas of energy independence. The same is true for Giorgia Meloni in Italy. So you see this, like, in all corners and all areas, that there is a backlash happening. So there is this very interesting, in the United States, I feel it happens a little bit slowly, but this very interesting change where many right-wing parties are becoming, they always, I think, have been to some extent, but they're now kind of becoming the new working class parties, whereas the former working class parties or the left-leaning parties are becoming quote unquote elite parties. You see this, by the way, just for those of your listeners who are interested in this. For example, in France, in Greece, in Italy, to some extent, the classic social democratic parties have basically disappeared. Right? They no longer have an audience. They no longer have a constituency. Like the radical left moved to the Green parties, and what was left of the working class has, to the most part, there are always exceptions, has to the most part moved to right-wing parties. So social democracy, we see it also in Germany, we see it in Austria, kind of that for once these parties had 40, almost in Austria, for example, they had almost 50% of the vote. Now they're struggling to keep it above 20%. So this uprising, as I call it, uprising might be a little bit of a strong term, but let's say this backlash against elites, this is definitely happening.
Yeah, so if there are free and fair elections, I think that it's going to be hard for this extreme hard left anti-working people agenda to succeed, don't you think? Global?
No, I think absolutely. And you see, one should make no mistake there, right? There are many movements underway or many attempts being made to crack down on the free distribution of information, right? I mean, the EU now has all kinds of terms: misinformation, disinformation, or a very new one that is my personal favorite, which is malinformation. And that's defined as information that is correct, but is used with bad intent. So you can imagine what that means. So you say something that is true, but if your intentions are wrong, you still should not be allowed or limited in being able to say it. So there are all these trends underway. And I think this is kind of an attempt by, quote unquote, let's call it the elite class or the ruling class, to clamp down on any kind of potential competition.
Are you following the work of, I think it's Mariana Spring from the BBC, where
Yes.
she has these podcasts about, she calls everybody who disagrees with her, they believe in conspiracies. It's like she knows what the truth is on climate, and she's trying to expose the fact that people disagree with her. I think it's just amazing. I've listened to a lot of her podcasts. What do you think of her work?
No, I think you're right. I mean, this is kind of the new go-to in many ways. That falls a little bit into this category. I have recently been called a white supremacist because apparently for white supremacists, nuclear energy is the energy form of choice. So I wasn't aware of this, right? That apparently nuclear fission is a white supremacist dog whistle. So exactly as you say, this is just kind of the new trend. Everything that comes from the right, or everything that comes and goes against the, let's say, established or manufactured, if you want, consensus, must be a conspiracy. But I think it no longer works. I mean, this has been totally ruined. A topic I don't really talk a lot about, but in this context, I think it's appropriate, that has been completely ruined in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. I mean, there have been too many things that we were told are conspiratorial, are not true, are just made up by nuts and, tinfoil head wearers, that now more and more are becoming part of the mainstream and seem to have been true all along, right? Whether it's lab leak or whether it's the fact that, of course, kind of any medical procedure, any vaccination will have a certain amount of side effects. And this comes out now too, even though we have been told there are like 0 side effects. It affects different age groups differently. All of this was denied for reasons, maybe we can talk about this a little bit later in the podcast, that were entirely unnecessary. Right? I think there is absolutely no shame, be it for politicians or let's call it the official representatives of science, to say there are things we don't know. There are things we're not sure about, but they feel this urge to say that whatever they believe, to whatever they claim, is 100%. Now, without going too deep into this, but I do have a little bit, if we want to get like overly philosophical, that this is an almost theological approach, right? I'm exaggerating slightly for dramatic effect, but I do mean it to some extent. Since we have replaced God in a sense with the state, right? And the quote unquote experts are the new priests, they must be infallible, right? What they say must be 100% true because they replace, again, quote unquote, the divine, the almighty. And I mean, what makes a God a God? Well, one of the things is because God is always right? There is no room for mistake. And they have taken what they think that they have taken this over. And therefore, they simply cannot say that, things are unclear, things might turn out worse, things might turn out better. And I think this is a little bit part of that story, kind of this cultural shift where we see, the secular institutions, the secular or certain individuals kind of within the secular realm as a replacement for the divine. Again, I would not necessarily call myself a particularly religious person, so I'm not trying here to make a case for religion per se, but this is a worrisome trend, I would argue, right? This idea that there are some groups or some institutions who just claim that they are right no matter what, right? It's what some commentators call, that science. It's that this idea that there is a part of the scientific community and they are simply always right.
Yeah, I personally do not think you're exaggerating. I think Michael Crichton wrote up this a long time ago, environmentalism as religion. I think it is a substitute straight up for religion for a lot of people. It gives meaning to their life. I think that's one reason why they get so furious if you show them data that indicates there isn't a climate crisis. Because if there isn't, then the thing that gives their life meaning is gone. I think it's a pretty big deal. Yeah, so good observation.
No, you're absolutely right. It's an emotional desire. And I think this is a topic we don't talk about enough, that whatever one thinks about the issue of climate change per se, for many of those who are active in the field, this is an ersatz religion. I think there can be no doubt about this. Even if you look at the individuals or some of the individuals that are engaged in this, or some of the main spokespeople, she's now old enough that I can make fun of her, but imagine you have a serious sickness, right? God forbid. And you would go to actual doctors, right? If a 12-year-old girl would come to you and tell you how to treat, let's say, a serious illness, how to treat cancer, you would say, that's very kind of you, but now please, let the doctor speak. But apparently in the climate religion, it was, now she's almost 20, I think, it was the 12-year-old girl who supposedly knew better than everybody else. And everybody jumped on this bandwagon, right? Because a new, almost a Joan of Arc-like figure, and that just, again, this it never felt right to me. Not everybody in this debate is the same, right? You have the one which I think is the smallest group, right? You have a very, very small group of people that really are convinced of this, right? I think there is a group of people that really get up every morning, look out of the window, and say, "Oh my God, the world is going to end tomorrow. This is going to be the end of it all." Then you have, another group who just plays along in a sense, right? So just, we could probably in some sense also call them, at least some of them are very successful grifters. This is Klaus Schwab is for me the best example here. I know probably some of your listeners won't like that too much, but I think that the World Economic Forum is kind of a malevolent force in the sense that they amplify something that is already there. But I'm pretty sure that Klaus Schwab, every evening he sits at home and claps himself on the shoulder and says, "I cannot believe what I'm doing, and this is actually working." And then you have like the third group, which kind of falls a little bit also with the second, which is companies, and they just play along because they simply don't want the controversy. We see this, just to build a parallel here, we see this also in the area of the whole transgender issue, right? One of the reasons why companies put the rainbow flag in their company logos, most of them don't do it because they're deeply convinced of it, or why they all talk about ESG. It's not because they're deeply convinced of it, but they know if they don't do it, somebody will ask them, "Why don't you care about ESG? Why don't you have a rainbow flag in your logo?" And then they have to justify themselves why they don't do it. So they say, "You know what? Just put it in there, and then we have peace. Then we have quiet." And it's kind of in this. And this, of course, reinforces itself in this triangle. And then people like you and I, it's much harder than for us because everybody gets along, right? If those go along to get along, if those who go along because they can make money of it, and if those who kind of push for it because they're really convinced of it, that's a very, very, despite coming from different motivations, those are three very, very powerful groups. And I think this is precisely what we are experiencing.
So my view is that it's all fun and games until the blackouts start and they start implementing CBDCs and you can't fly anymore and all these other real world impacts. Do you agree with that? Or?
I do, but you can already see how the conversation is shifting. If you take California, for example, or the United States, so everybody knows that the grid is really under pressure, right? The grids, usually grid stability, if you have more than 20% for wind and solar, it gets more and more unstable, and that really is a problem. But now the conversation is that it's not the renewables that make the grid unstable, it's extreme weather events. And of course, extreme weather events are a consequence of climate change. So it's in fact climate change that makes the grids unstable, not the failed policies of the past. So this is kind of where I see the shift of the conversation. It is becoming the god of the gaps, right? Whatever happens, it must be climate change. It's never climate change policies. It's always climate change itself. And you will see exactly what you just mentioned. If these consequences are going to materialize themselves, and I would expect this to happen this year or next year, you will hear this just means we have to do it even more. We have to double down. There is, if you want to use that term, there is a sincere cognitive dissonance, right? Instead of stepping back and saying, you know what, maybe we took a wrong turn a couple of years in the past, they say, no, we have to do it more. You see this in Germany, right? Germany was, and I think this is, again, very important for your listeners and your viewers, the German energy crisis, where everybody now says, you guys were all panicking, you guys were all, making up these nightmare scenarios, and look how well it ultimately went. This was an extremely unusual warm winter. Like, it was off by several, standard deviations compared to recent years. Like, this was completely unexpected. I'm glad it didn't happen, don't get me wrong. But this is now this weird idea that people are mixing up luck with strategy. Like, this was not a brilliant strategy. This was sheer dumb luck. If this would have been a really cold winter, things would have gone really problematic really fast. And they planned for it, right? Same in Austria. I mean, there were plans for blackouts. There were plans for brownouts and all these kind of things. So the expectation was that this can happen. We were then lucky that people didn't have to heat as much. We were very lucky that industry shut down faster than expected. But of course, as we also know, if you lose your industry, that's also not, that's like, as they say, shooting yourself in the head to avoid a headache. So this is also not something that's particularly helpful. And this is what's very bothersome about this, is that whatever is going to happen, like, there is no willingness to take a step back and say, maybe something was done wrong in the past. It's now we have to do it even faster. Like, we need more solar, we need more wind. And let's be completely honest about this. There was recently an article, a very well-written one in the Telegraph. Northern Europe will never get energy independent via solar. This is absolutely insane because the sun isn't there. And for those of you, maybe some of your viewers and listeners have heard this as well. Now there is this new plan. It was in Politico, and it was now approved by the White House, right, to put aerosols into the atmosphere to limit the rays of the sun that reach the Earth. So we have now reached, first of all, kind of avoiding the sun to cool the Earth, which is so absurd if you consider that literally, not metaphorically, literally, the sun is the reason for all life on this planet. So I'd be very careful about this. But the second thing is, so we build all these solar panels, and now we say we have to avoid the sun. We have to make sure that less sunlight comes to the planet. And this is then just, at some point, as I said, it's so weird. We have to take it seriously because, again, many people really believe this. But if you look at this and from an objective viewpoint, if you're an alien landing on this planet and you look at these proposals, you will say, whatever the reality of climate change, about which we can talk separately, but if you look at the proposals that are supposedly addressing climate change, a lot of this is sheer insanity, right? It's whether it's EVs, whether it's wind and solar in Northern Europe, whether it's completely abandoning or going against nuclear energy. So all these proposals, whatever they do, is they're not solving the problem. They're just satisfying what you mentioned quite nicely before, a very specific ideological religious belief. And I think we should point that out.
What percent of voters do you think actually would vote for blocking out the sun and putting up aerosols to block out the sun to prevent bad weather? I got to believe it's under 10% of voters would give that a big thumbs up. Or what do you think from your perspective?
I think you're right. And to be completely honest, I don't think it's possible. We hear these proposals all the time. For 25 years, we have been hearing that the new, forever rechargeable, forever working battery is just around the corner. If you go on Google and you Google battery breakthrough, we have a new article about a battery breakthrough we had it for 25 years. It's still not there. Right? I'm sure it's going to happen one day. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. But there are just lots of these ideas out there where people make a lot of money. And I give you one example. I forgot the name. There was a very clever person, a very smart person. It's a young African entrepreneur, and he got a prize because he supposedly invented a machine that takes the vibration of people walking on the street and turns it into electricity. Now, fantastic, amazing stuff. So it was in Germany. So he got a prize, right, for kind of finding innovative answers to the energy crisis. And somebody said, can we see the machine? Like, can you show it to us? And then it turns out it doesn't exist. It never existed, right? They didn't justify the price by saying, well, it's kind of a beacon of light that it kind of motivates people to think outside the box. So, they tried to kind of save face by this. But the fact is, all these ideas, and you see the same in the United States now with the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it's basically a fire hose of money into everything supposedly renewable. So you will have plenty of very clever, don't get me wrong, very clever grifters who are going to come up with all kinds of stuff just to get the money, because it's a free-for-all at the moment. It's a shuttles to gold miners kind of thing. So they will tell you all kind of inventions that they are just about ready to be implemented, and they're going to get a lot of money for this. Until, as you just correctly pointed out, at some point, people are going to realize that this is just not working. So this idea, I can only stress this enough, to change the amount of sunlight that reaches the globe. I got an email back on this, and somebody said, we can do it in a way that kind of where the sun is not needed, it won't be, but where it's going to be needed, it will be. I'm so sorry. That's just science fiction. I don't believe it. If this should work, I'm the first one to admit, publicly that I was wrong. But this is just insane. Even the article in Politico ultimately said, well, there are many drawbacks, and it's still in its infancy, so it's not clear if it can really work. And that's kind of precisely where we are, right? It's all these new ideas because there's so much money in it.
So speaking of money, are you keeping track of what's going on with the carbon markets, if that's really going to take off? I think Michelle Sterling has described it as a non-delivery of an invisible substance to no one. I know there was a Chicago Climate Exchange here that went bust maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But right now, how's that going in Europe?
Yeah, I know it's the same thing. It's exactly what you described, right? It's the same kind of scheme that you have with this falls into this category, right? With so-called carbon offsets, right? When you fly the airplane and then your airline offers you, if you pay like €5 extra to your ticket or €10 extra, that they will do some magical gimmicky and they will offset the carbon emissions from your flight with something else. This is all done by companies who pretty much they rubber stamp something where nobody really knows what's actually happening. I hope you forgive my strong language. It's a grip. But it's, again, companies know it looks good, right? If you say, well, if you fly, airline XYZ, and you can actually offset your carbon emissions. So I make a little click. It might cost me €5. So basically, a croissant and the coffee. But I can then say, oh, I'm still carbon neutral, even though, I went on vacation to Bali. That is very seductive. But it's, again, to go back to what you said before, but this is almost like the Catholic Church at the time of Martin Luther, right? Where he said, well, I'm a horrible sinner. I cavort with prostitutes and drink alcohol all the time and all these kind of things. But then I go to church and I throw a few coins, or I donate a couple of coins, and then I'm freed from my sins. It's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, you mentioned this before about the parallels between standard religion and environmental religion. You've got the lighting of the candles, and you've got the Bible as the IPCC report. It goes on and on. That so many parallels that it's not just a coincidence. Getting back to the extreme weather thing, are you a fan of Tony Heller at all? Because there's this whole idea that our grid is going down because the weather is getting worse. But Tony Heller is doing all this work showing that the weather is not getting worse. And they can't erase the fact that there's all these reports of how bad the weather was 100 years ago. I know they want us to forget about that, but Tony's not letting us forget about it. Do you follow that at all? The extreme weather?
I do. And there are kind of two things about this for me to say. One is, the statistics are absolutely clear, and even pointing, as you just mentioned as well, even pointing that out already makes you a heretic. I'm so sorry. I have a hard time speaking today. I don't know why. In the eyes of many, which is that weather and climate-related death are actually on the decline. This is again, Björn Lomborg did yeoman's work on this. This is just a fact. And the other thing is, I'm open to everything. But the idea, kind of whether it's the weather or the climate, that we know precisely what the weather was in Central America 7,000 years ago, just strikes me as odd. And if you take a closer look, I mean, Mark Stein has actually made a nice compendium of scientists criticizing Michael Mann's famous hockey stick graph, right? We're basically in the middle of the hockey stick graph, they use different tools, they use different indicators to measure what the temperature was. I think a lot of it is a certain kind of trees, I think in the north of Canada. And again, I'm not saying that this means nothing, but it's just the idea that we know exactly what the climate was 10, 15, 20,000 years ago. I'm just skeptical about this. I think everybody should be. I think if you talk, at least as I did, if you talk to people like Stephen Koenig, right, who wrote the fantastic book Unsettled Science, there are different takes, different opinions on this. And just saying, you're a denier and the conversation is over, that's not a scientific approach. There is something, just to mention this real quickly, because kind of to also go a little bit deeper here, what's very often now called so-called climate cancellations. And what I mean by this is that there are conferences, that there are events where people who have a different take on climate change, they are no longer invited. So it's true that you have a manufactured consent, and it's like 99% have the same opinion, because everybody who has a different opinion is not invited to the event. And this is, of course, we saw this at one of the, I think, the COP27. And this is also now an issue at the COP28, right? Where, for example, they barely invited anybody from the oil and gas industry. So they talked about the end of fossil fuels, but nobody who actually knows how fossil fuels work was invited. I mean, this is on the one hand, it's dishonest. And on the other hand, it shows you how in many of these areas, consent is coming together. You simply say that the other opinion doesn't exist. This doesn't necessarily mean that they are wrong, but if I'm so certain of my position, I should be capable of arguing it. And this is, again, what I'm missing here a little bit. And the other thing is, we talked about this as well, and I think we've got to talk about this in greater detail. But I'll come to it later. I'm sorry, I don't want to make this an endless monologue.
No, I like it if you did make it an endless monologue. I love your stuff. I did have a different question about, some of your articles have pointed out that climate alarmism is a luxury belief. So it's if all of your other problems in life are solved, then you have time to worry about this non-issue, or that it's about climate activism isn't about the planet, it's about boredom of the elites. You want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. It is entirely a phenomenon of wealthy. If I want to play the race card, I could say of wealthy white people. But it's primarily a phenomenon that you see in the West, right? It's those of us who are kind of on top of the food chain when it comes to energy, when it comes to material comfort, are the ones who want to now pull up the ladder for everybody else. I'm absolutely convinced of this. It's a kind of, if you want, you can call it, it's a form of energy mercantilism, in a sense. So we tell everybody else that they have to stick to the kind of living standards they have right now, so that we save the planet. But of course, at the same time, we are not really willing to change our living standards. And let me give you a very clear example for this. Joe Biden, right? President Joe Biden, like the climate change, climate saving President Joe Biden. Joe Biden has been draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve because he knows if gasoline prices go over a certain limit, he will have huge problems during the elections. So he's just an old school politician like anybody else. He talks about climate, but if gasoline, if diesel gets too expensive, they start drawing from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, because he knows where his bread is buttered, and he knows that there are certain limits to what people are actually going to accept. Germany, the country of the answer to the climate crisis, right? The Germans know how to do it. You could not look as fast as they brought back their coal power plants last year during the crisis. Right? They didn't have to use all of them. That is correct, because it was a warm winter. But they stood ready to go. So immediately they have coal ready, because even German politicians know how many blackouts or how long a blackout would the German people accept before it comes to an open revolt. And this is what I mean when I say it's a luxury belief. It's a kind of belief where that's easy to talk about, but nobody really ever wants to feel the consequences. What would happen if we would do everything that these people preach us to do? Take another example. Just stop oil. Are you kidding me? Just stop fossil fuels. Let's be generous, right? Official statistics say that about 85% of global primary energy comes from fossil fuels. Let's be generous and say it's only 70%, right? Let's be, let's say they're all exaggerated. Let's say it's 70%. Can you imagine what the world would look like if within the next 5 years, we would lose 70% of primary energy? I'm not exaggerating here. Billions would die, and much faster, much quicker than we could imagine. And this is, for me, the calculation we have to make. They say, and maybe it is true, that climate change will kill millions and billions of people. Maybe it does. But if we randomly, abruptly end fossil fuels, we know it's going to kill billions of people. So that's our speculation then. We know it's going to kill billions of people. And again, we have to think that this from a practical viewpoint. Imagine, just I give you a very stupid example, but I think it highlights it. Imagine you're an elderly lady living, on the 32nd floor in New York. What happens if New York all of a sudden says, we do the same thing they do in Kabul, we only have electricity for 2-3 hours a day, and that elderly lady has a heart attack? There is no way that medics can get to her in time. No way in hell. Hospitals need 2.6 times more energy than other commercial buildings. People will no longer be able to afford medical care because hospitals will say, we have to pay so much for energy because if there's less energy, the price goes up. So where will they get the money from? Well, they will get it from their quote unquote customers or the patients. You want to get an MRI? I'm sorry, man, that's going to cost a lot of electricity. You need an iron lung, right? You're in a coma and you need to be fed by a tube, or you need to get oxygen via a machine. Sorry, we can't do this unless you're a millionaire or a billionaire. So I think we or the movement, whatever their goals are, they don't think it through. They have no respect. They have no idea what energy, fossil or otherwise, actually does for us. And this is what bothers me so much. There is no civilized life. There is no form of material, neither progress or even material continuity without the energy or the amount of energy that we're currently using. And we're using more every year because more people want to get wealthy. This is, again, something that's completely ignored. Just to give you one quick number. And to be clear, I'm not misspeaking here. In order for sub-Saharan Africa to reach the same level of energy that Germany had in 1965, it would have to grow by a factor of 10. Currently, 2.4 billion people in the world have access to the same amount of energy as France and Germany had in 1860. We cannot simply ask those people to continue to live like that. And I wouldn't do it, because for me, this is another piece I wrote. This is, for me, I'm doing this because I want to be facetious a little bit, but this is, for me, a form of racism. It's because these are, all, as we would say in modern parley, these are all people of color. And we basically just say, well, too bad for you guys, nothing we can do. So you're going to continue to heat and cook with dung and with wood, which is, of course, is both bad for emissions and very bad for health. Well, your children going to die sooner. Healthcare, well, not going to work for you. I mean, this is a horrible, horrible thing to do, and they won't play along, and neither should they.
Yeah, you wrote an article that I liked on this issue. The title was "Climate Activism, Not Climate Change, is the Real Racist Force. Africans Deserve Electricity." I love the fact that you're standing up for that idea. But there's all sorts of maybe World Bank folks that seriously want to deny Africans fossil fueled electricity, correct? They want to help out the world by denying them the chance to have the same energy that we have. I think it's straight up evil, I think.
It's kind of the worst kind of evil, because it's evil with good intentions, which unfortunately we see way too often. But just to kind of let's really dig a little bit deeper into this. In a sense, the world is rolling the dice on climate change anyways. I know this is a thing nobody wants to hear, But the world is rolling the dice because even if Europeans and Americans, let's say we achieve our climate goals, India is not gonna stop growing their emissions, and neither should they because they have 1.7 billion people to take care of. China will not stop it, and at some point Africa is gonna catch up. So if all the Greta Thunbergs and John Kerrys are so serious about this crisis, I mean, at what point? Again, I'm being provocative here, but at what point will they suggest that we have to bombard coal power plants in India and China? Because ultimately, that would be the answer, because they're not going to stop it. Right? They simply won't. Indonesia, the same thing. So this is, again, when I say it's a luxury belief, because it's something that makes you feel good. You're standing up for the right thing, right? You make carbon offsets when you fly on your vacation, on your private plane. But if you really say you want to draw down carbon emissions that supposedly will have the impact that is needed, you would have to stop development for 3-4 billion people. And that's inhumane. And for me, and nobody could answer that question to me. I said, okay, so your argument is that climate change will ultimately kill more people, because that's the argument, than not getting those people a higher level of development, higher standards of living. So my question then is how? How? Because they need at some point to put the numbers at it. Because supposedly some things can no longer be reversed anyways. Okay, so the CO2 that's in the atmosphere, we'll see whether carbon capture is something that's going to happen in the future. Although even there, all the environmentalists are against it, which is just like nuclear. I don't understand why. They are like every solution that we would have, they are against. Right? They're against genetically modified crops. They're against carbon capture. They're against nuclear power. So every real solution we would have, they're against. The only thing they are for is to turn everything off and shut everything down. And that's just something that I find weird. And let me give another point. Because this was a lot of the feedback I got for the article about Africa. The argument was, and kind of the feedback I got was, if they have the same standard of living that we do, if they live in the same kind of material welfare, then there is the risk that there will be even more people, which is, again, probably the most racist thing you can say. So they are basically saying, the way to save the climate is to have less people on this planet. The way to have less people on this planet is to deny those who are in the stage of developing, to deny them that kind of development, because then more of them are going to die sooner, and therefore we save the climate. And what a horrible, horrible worldview. And I don't want to be part of that, to be quite honest.
I think you may have written that Africa has 65% of the remaining arable land in the world.
Correct.
And they could feed 9 billion people just with that. Am I correct there? Yeah, that's a pretty amazing statistic. It's
nobody is denying that the change of climate, the change of temperature has impact. But it is a simple fact that, and again, this is an argument the environmentalists or the kind of the Malthusian, depopulationists hate, which is that human ingenuity has answers to all of this. It's simply not true that all of a sudden we will no longer know how to farm, or that we will no longer know how to increase yields per acre of land, because we have done it in the past and we'll do it in the future. But the problem is, of course, if you deny and sabotage everything that makes that possible, then you have a problem. And this is, again, something that bothers me. So you deny the solutions and then claim there are none. And this is a very, very insidious thing to do. And I have to quite be honest here, the argument or the time frame that they are making, again, this brings me back to the point I made before. I think it's now 6 years. I think the mayor of London and King Charles, they have christened this new doomsday clock. And if we don't change course in 6 years, it's all going to be over. I mean, we have been hearing this since the 1970s, but I leave this, I put a pin in this for now. So if we only have 6 years, then I say, well, then we have to move even faster with technology, because we will not get rid, and I have to raise my voice here, we will not get rid of fossil fuels in the next 6 years. Whoever claims that is either delusional or a liar. It is not going to happen. And I come back to the point I made before, because even the supposedly most ardent supporters of climate change policies, Joe Biden, the German government, if things get critical, they turn to coal, they turn to oil. To give another example, in the United States, in the in the Northeast last year, like upstate New York and these areas, they were burning oil to produce electricity. So, and of course, people in the developing world know that, right? They don't look at what we say, they look at what we do, and they draw their conclusions accordingly.
I just wanted to mention that how especially insane it is that people think that a place like Minnesota, where I'm sitting right now, that's too warm, because the average temperature year round is about 45 degrees Fahrenheit or 7.2 degrees Celsius. The whole idea that if it warms another degree from there, that my life is going to be hellish because it's going to be too hot, it just boggles my mind that rational people might believe anything like that, that adults could believe that if it gets a little warmer here, even though we see that people that live in Iowa or they live in way hotter places, people are just doing fine. I don't know why people would think that life would be hellish with a tiny bit of warming. I'm not buying it.
No, I agree. And the thing is, even if it would be, I can only go back to the point that we made before. They say, their words, not mine, they basically say it's too late anyways. So my point is, because I'm a climate agnostic in a sense, right? Whatever happens, I assume we will have to adapt one way or another. It's like, if an earthquake happens, you have to rebuild. If a volcano breaks out, you have to rebuild. And it's the same thing here. But once the volcano has broken out, once the earthquake has happened, right, you cannot go back and reverse it. And I think, and I'm just using the language that Charles III is using. If we are that close to the end, if we are that close to the abyss, it's too late to turn back anyways. And this really, again, what I want for your listeners and your viewers to understand, there is simply no way to achieve the goals that they have set over the next 6 years. It's simply not going to happen. And they know it, right? Every year you hear, here are the climate goals. And then at the year after, everybody's missing those climate goals. I think the only country that actually met the overperformed one was South Africa. And that was because they had blackouts all the time. And if you talk to people in South Africa, that is not really a model that anybody wants to imitate. So the simple fact is that if it is as bad as they say, and again, I'm not a climatologist, it might be, it might not be, but if it is as bad as they say, we are running the experiment. Because India, China, Indonesia, and all these other countries, Vietnam, they are not going to change their development. And I know, now the argument is, yes, but the Chinese, they build so much solar and they build so much wind, and all true, but it's a minuscule fraction of their overall energy use. It's the same as I said before. If you look at global primary energy use, wind and solar is not even 10%. It's not even 5%. So the idea that this will replace all the other 85% in the next 6 years is insane. And it gets even worse. Let me give you another number. You know what the only thing was that they replaced with wind and solar?
No. What?
Nuclear.
Oh.
Like if you look at energy use, like you have the line for nuclear, it gets smaller, and the line for wind and solar gets a little bit broader, but the two or the three big ones underneath it, oil, gas, and coal, they pretty much stay the same, right, on a global scale. So this is the insanity. So we actually had a reliable, low carbon, and some would even say no carbon form of electricity and potentially primary energy production. And we replaced it with an entirely unreliable and very resource intensive form of electricity production. And this brings me back to what we said originally. The only way to explain this is with ideology or a desire for a quasi-religious outlet. I cannot explain it any other way. I mean, the oil and gas industry, of course, if you look at last year, if you were invested in coal, you made a fortune. They had one of the best years in their history. And now they're telling us we're going to be rid of coal in 6 years. It's best of luck. Best of luck is all I can say.
What do you think of this theory I've heard from several people about there's collective guilt in places like Germany over things that have happened in the past, and that to try to atone for their sins of the past, then they have to be good people and try to run their country on wind and solar? Do you think that's a real
100%.
Okay.
100%. I'm very glad you mentioned this because I always forget this point, but it's a very important one. No, you're 100% right. The idea is that, and I think this is ultimately, so I'm really happy you mentioned this. I think this is ultimately what motivates so much of this movement. The idea is that, and by the way, Greta Thunberg says almost precisely this in her, I think, first or most recent book, that the West brought capitalism and colonialism and the world wars and destroyed the fictional, harmonious state of the world. And now we have to atone for it. And how do you atone for destroying the world in the past? You save it in the future. So I think that's absolutely part of the story. That's a major part of the story. So I'm very glad you mentioned this. I could not agree more. There is no doubt in my mind. And you see how the language has shifted. Right? Originally, it was about the environment, about the climate. Now it's about changing the system. It's about how capitalism is the problem, how the Western way of life is the problem, all these kind of things, which is, in my opinion, precisely what you say. It's a search for a form of atonement. But the question is, can we atone for the past by sacrificing our future? And this brings me back to the working class part, will the average person go along with this? You mentioned Bloomberg before. Bloomberg had a wonderful sentence. They say that how does it? On the path from, on the path from abundance to scarcity is riot. And I think that's absolutely true. So if you think that the people in the West or elsewhere will simply accept shrinking and lowering their living standards in the name of climate change, you have another thing coming, because they won't. They will turn to the parties that say, we are against this. They will turn to the parties that say, we're against this climate madness. And it's already happening, right? We see it happening in Germany. We see it happening in Italy. We see it happening in Sweden. We see it happening in Austria. So the idea that those who are most affected by it, people in a low income class, will go along by something that is proposed or forced upon them by the upper and higher income class that barely feels the consequences of what they're proposing, is not going to happen. And I know this is an old saying, and I know it gets boring, but it is true. It is ridiculous that people who fly around in private jets all the time now tell the little people, so to speak, that they can no longer do this. And I'm sure that many of your viewers and listeners have seen the famous interview with John Kerry, where a journalist asks him, but why is it okay if you fly in a private jet? And he says, well, people like me, they have no choice, right? But we do so much, we're entitled to it. But my mother, who has grandchildren in the United States, well, nothing we can do. You can't see them. Go on Zoom, go on Skype. You can no longer see them. And people are not going to go along with it. And I can only say this again, neither should they. Neither should they.
So I was not aware that, are there politicians or parties in places like Germany that don't buy into the climate scam, and they're willing to speak out and say, we're not buying into this and we're for the little people?
Yeah. No, this has been originally, and this is what makes this politically quite interesting. Originally, the main topic for the right-wing parties was always migration. It was always the question of immigration. But now they have found, if you will, a second topic, and that's climate policies. And this is resonating because everybody sees their energy bills, right? Everybody sees, for example, in Germany, what's happening to the industry. The same, in Britain, so people can feel this really in their pocketbook quite significantly. So this is a major topic, particularly for the right. Whatever one thinks about the right, if they are the first ones to catch on to this, well, this is part of a democracy, right? Which is also, of course, and you see this also in the United States, you see it in Europe, there is now this new idea that policy in this area should not be made by parliament, but by some kind of people's assemblies that are selected by, basically by rolling a dice. And then they will be advised by special experts, and then they make the decisions. And I'm not joking here, right? These are really suggestions that are being made. They're basically, for the history fans among the audience, so basically to have like small climate Soviets that then dictate what's supposed to happen. And you have a parliament that I assume that is only supposed to rubber stamp those decisions. So they know this, right? They know that democracy is not gonna work for these proposals, because nobody is gonna vote voluntarily for lowering or continuously lowering the living standards. So they try to find ways via climate. They say again openly, it's a climate emergency. It's like a war. I mean, what do you do in a war, right? You suspend civil rights. You impose martial law. I mean, so that rhetoric, the language they use, that's very systematic. That's no coincidence. If you say the end happens in 3 years, like they even use, this picture. It's like Great Britain during the Blitz, right? It's like World War II. Like we have to mobilize everything, but that's ultimately always mean that we have to restrict our individual freedom. We have to restrict individual liberties. We have to restrict something we talked at the beginning of the show. We have to restrict the free dissemination of information, right? Because it's just too dangerous. It's basically like, when your country is at war, you cannot allow people to make propaganda against the war effort. And it's kind of the same thing here, right? The climate crisis needs to be managed, so everybody who doubts it must be defunded, or as we see in other areas, must be debanked or must be banned from social media. And this is a very dangerous development. And I think people like you and I and the audience that we reach, we have to stand up against this.
How is it going in the Netherlands? Is there a lot of political support for the farmers as they try to fight to keep their land from being seized?
Yes, from the farmers' perspective, yes. Their main representative, the Farmer Citizen Movement, the BVB, the party, is so far turning out to be a little bit of a disappointment, I have to admit. I think many were hoping that they would, let's say, stick more to their guns. They for some, including myself, they seem to be too willing to compromise on too many issues. Just to give you one example, because you mentioned the Netherlands. In Groningen, right, in the Netherlands, they have the largest natural gas field in Europe. And they're in October, it will be closed down. I mean, again, this is an energy policy that makes no sense whatsoever. And I think at some point, hopefully, people are going to wake up to this. But resistance, I would argue, is still kind of growing slowly. There's also the problem, I think, also on our part, right? How we formulate, let's put it this way, the resistance in a sense, right? Because I think the main argument, and I made this before, the main argument for me is always, as long as the consequences of the proposed policies are worse than the consequences of the supposed problem, I can never go along with these policies. And then again, these absurdities, to give you one example, Ireland is now supposed, I think they after a public protest, they took it back a little bit, is now supposed to kill 65,000 cows because of the emissions that are created by cows. I mean, I'm out of words here almost. The idea that 60,000 cows in Ireland have any measurable effect on the global climate is entirely insane. It's entirely insane. But, and we come back to our original point, but just as they did in pagan times, sacrificing a bull, sacrificing a cow was something very common. And it is nothing different because it does not make a dent, no matter how severe the climate crisis is, or the climate non-crisis, whatever you want to call it is. 65,000 cows in Ireland make no difference. The only thing it's going to do, it's going to make beef more expensive for the people. That's the only effect you have. So your cheeseburger is not going to be $2, it's going to be $4. But the climate is going to develop exactly the way it would have anyways. So it's once again a policy proposal aimed almost exclusively at punishing the lower middle class and the working class. And this is the point that has to be stressed. All these policies have a price tag, and that price tag is primarily affecting those who don't have a lot to begin with. It's true on a global scale, Africa, India, China, but it's also true on a local scale, killing your cows, right? Forcing people to buy more expensive renewable energy, which is more expensive. Right? Just the next slide. We don't have a single country where the increase of renewables led to lower energy costs for the people, like because they trick us. I mean, it's borderline fraud. They look at, for example, what a wind turbine or a solar panel produces at the best possible time under the best possible conditions. And that's then the number they take to say, this is what it costs. But they, of course, never tell you that you need to make the transmission lines that cost money. They never tell you that you need basically a secondary grid to jump in when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. They never tell you that. So this is, again, this is, as I said, it's either incompetence or it's borderline fraud. So the people in many of these are being lied to. And just to make this point as well, and this is, at least this is my argument. And for me, this spills over into other topics of the climate debate as well. Because if they lie to me in one area, how do I know that they speak the truth in other areas? This is kind of a thing. If they tell me that you can power an industrialized economy like Germany's with wind and solar, and the same people tell me the world is going to end in 6, 10, 16 years, I know that what they say about energy is wrong. So why should I trust them when they say something about climate? And that's kind of that's let's say my major point here. There is too much being said. There has been too much being said in the past. We were told that the Arctic will be ice-free. The Arctic is supposed to be ice-free since, I think, 15 years. We were told that New York, Miami will be underwater by 2020. I just checked it because I was thinking, man, real estate prices in Manhattan and Miami must be really low because they're basically, they're up to their throats in water. It turns out it's just expensive as it has ever been. Apparently, many of the most fearful climate alarmists have no problem buying houses and real estate in Malibu and Martha's Vineyard. I'm wondering why. I mean, supposedly, right, these are the areas that will be washed away, washed into the sea in the very near foreseeable future. Yet they pump their money in it because, as we said before, they don't really believe it themselves. And they say, if you drill a little deeper into the publications, you will always reach the point where they say, well, we have several scenarios, but in order to incentivize action, we assume the worst. So even they know that the worst case scenario, which is possible, is also very unlikely. So when they are then kind of challenged to say, do I really believe in the worst case scenario? Or do I want my beach house in Malibu? Most of them opt for the beach house in Malibu, right? Most of them opt for the loft in New York. And this is, as I said, why should I trust those people? I have no reason to trust them.
What do you think is next up if the climate cult, the climate scam dies off? I've heard some people say this is a line in the sand, that they don't have something else that they're going to shift to. But do you have any ideas on what else might be the next thing up after this whole climate alarmism is gone?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could share your optimism. I'm not so sure that it will be gone that soon. I mean, I'm always torn. I'm always back and forth. I have myself very often used the hashtag peak green. So I'm going back and forth on this issue, but I believe that we already see a shift. Let me give you one quick example. So originally it was about emissions, right? Everything was about CO2 emissions. That was the big topic. I feel that they are now shifting to the more general term of energy use. I mean, this is what Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, who, to be honest, I think is a horrible, he might be a nice person as a person, but what he's saying and what he's doing in his office, I find absolutely horrible. And he pretty much already made that shift, right? So this is why they're against nuclear. This is why they're against carbon capture and sequestration, because they don't want to solve the problem. Their problem, what they think the problem is that there are too many people on this planet. This is what they want to get rid of. This is an anti-humanist Malthusian cult. So even if we would have a solution, which we do, like one piece is nuclear, the other piece is replacing coal with gas, another piece is carbon capture. So there are fantastic existing technologies, but they don't support them because they want us to use less energy, period. They want people to get poorer. Like this is an attack on everybody's desire, or on the, let's say, on the human idea or the basic human desire that we want improving living standards. I really cannot stress this enough. And this is to answer your question. This is how they shifted. So we will reach the point where even if we could solve the problem, they say, well, but it's energy use per se. And this is, again, one of the things that I fear at the moment. I think they will try. It will get worse before it gets better.
I think I've heard some people phrase it from the point of view of the elites, there's too many of us and just the right amount of them.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think that's very good. And like to give again one example, it is absolutely inexplicable to me how somebody like Paul Ehrlich, right, the famous author of The Population Bomb, is still, being carried around from talk show to talk show and featured in fawning pieces. I think one was in Time magazine, if I'm not mistaken. He was literal, not metaphorically. He was literally wrong on everything he said. I mean, this is, and he's still not the man with the prophet of doom. No, if you're a prophet, you have to be right about something. Like just going out and saying we're all gonna die, and then nobody does. He simply was wrong on everything. And this is, to go back again to your question, this is what I do not understand. The same is true with all these predictions. We can go back to the 70s. I mean, the famous publication Nature, they had an article in 1975. Actually, coincidentally, I think it's possible that actually you posted this, if I remember correctly, or somebody adjacent to our Twitter network. That in 1975, like Nature had this article where they said, well, there will be variations, but one thing is absolutely clear: the world is gonna cool. Right. Again, I'm not begrudging the 1975 scientists writing that, because I'm sure that back in the day, this was what the data showed. But apparently now the data has shifted, has changed, and so does the outlook. So again, how do I know that that's not going to be the case again? We were told forests are going to die. Like Europe, it will be the forest will, it's acid rain. There won't be any forests left in the late 1990s. Well, if you look, Europe at the moment has so much forest. In Austria, for example, we don't know what to do with it. Like it grows in many areas faster than we can cut it down. And another consequence of this is, if you look at the forest fires in California and in the fires in Canada, right, that kind of forest management has gotten so bad. But this is the same as we will see with the grid. So forest management got so bad that you have these fires, but instead of saying what it is, bad forest management, they will tell you it's climate change. And the same will happen with the grid. You will have blackouts, you will have rolling blackouts, you will have brownouts. They will not tell you it's because what we're doing to the grid is simply overcharging it. They will say it's the weather, it's climate. And this is, I think, what I'm afraid at the moment is that they're simply in many areas are gonna double down on their ideology. I mean, if you allow me this one very important sentence. I'd be willing to change my mind. I'm always willing to change my mind, but I'd be absolutely willing to change my mind if they can give me a pilot project. Give me a city, 15, 20,000 people, and run it only on wind, solar, and batteries for a year. That's all I'm asking. Give me a pilot project. Right? In any company would first invest in a prototype before they make a major transition. So give me the prototype. Give me a fictional, small village in an area that resembles, let's say, quote unquote, kind of the most common geographic and climatic conditions where most people live, and have them live 1 year without fossil fuels, only wind, solar, and battery. Then we can talk. If that works, if they can manage it, then all right. Then I'm willing to reconsider. But nobody has ever done it because it's impossible. It's simply impossible.
I would love to do another episode at some point if you're available.
Oh yeah, anytime.
Okay. All right. So we will go ahead and wrap up. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed this discussion. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tom, for your time. This was wonderful.
All right. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.
Yep. Goodbye.